If you're a Thomas fan and grew up in the 80s, 90s or early 2000s, then there's a good chance that you either had or wanted a collection of toys from the Ertl Thomas & Friends range, the first of many collectible die-cast Thomas & Friends toy lines. But what if the Ertl range never was? Another company putting out small die-cast toy trains during the 1980s was Matchbox. I'm sure that most of you won't need an introduction to this company, but in short they were a company originally based in the UK and now owned by Mattel, and they've been producing die-cast toy vehicles since 1953. Their range of toy trains was small but memorable, and I often wonder how things would have been if the range had been expanded upon in the form of a Thomas license. There's only one way to find out. So for this video, I'm foregoing the regular formula of drawing illustrations in Sketchbook Pro, and I'm instead going to make some models in Blender. It's been a good couple of years since I last properly used this program, and so the process of building these models also involved refamiliarising myself with the program, and just getting a bit annoyed when the program didn't do what I expected it to do. Incidentally, I would not advise anyone to use this video as a tutorial, because the way I go about doing things is frequently not the ideal or optimal method. My first point of action was to model an existing engine in the Matchbox range, to give myself an idea on how a Matchbox engine is typically constructed, and get a feel for the visual style of a Matchbox engine. So when I model the Thomas characters, I'll have an easier time following the pre-existing Matchbox range stylistically. Matchbox have released trains in various forms. There were some trains in their Models of Yesteryear range. In the early 1990s they brought out the Railways range, also known as Locomobile, a smaller motorised system. Then there was the buildable train they made to tie into Toy Story 3. More recently there was the Heavy Railer in their regular range. In this video I'm focusing on the trains that Matchbox made for their regular 1/64 range during the 1970s and 1980s, also known as Superfast or the 75 series. I say 1/64, but whilst the cars in this range are 1/64, their trains definitely weren't. They're probably closer to 1/100 scale, somewhere between TT and HO scale. This range of trains had 6 vehicles: an 040 tank engine, a diesel shunter, a pannier tank engine, a passenger coach, a conflat and a tipper wagon. For this video I've decided to model the 040. I prepared myself by taking measurements for the engine. Given the engine's small size, I had to work in quite a small scale when recreating it. This created a mild downside when it came to adding new shapes and meshes. In other 3D modelling programs, such as Maya or 3ds Max, you pick a shape and click and drag somewhere in the viewport to draw the desired shape into the scene. Meanwhile, in Blender, selecting a shape drops it into the scene at a fixed size. For example, the cube is 2 square meters, and given I'm modelling a toy that is less than 10 centimeters in length, it means the first thing you'd have to do after adding a shape is shrink it down to a workable size every time. The best, or indeed the worst, thing is that you can't change the default size of the meshes. Oh well, it's not the end of the world, I suppose. The method I've used to record this is a bit different to my drawing videos. For starters, I'm using a PC rather than a drawing tablet. Also, unlike Sketchbook, Blender doesn't have a time-lapse feature. I tried looking for time-lapse add-ons, but none of them seemed to do what I wanted them to do. In the end, I just used OBS to record the program. The downside is that whereas Sketchbook time-lapse feature will only record if I'm actively modifying the image, OBS will of course record everything, which means I have to have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to do as I start recording, and can't take breaks whilst OBS is still recording, lest I end up with a load of dead air, or whatever the visual equivalent is called. You may notice a lot more jump cuts as a result of this, although I do get a bit more confident as the video goes on. The Matchbox 040 had a plethora of different guises over the years, but for this modelling exercise I've gone with its iconic red and black colour scheme. If I may go on a little tangent about the Matchbox 040 for a moment, I have a bit of a theory that it may be loosely based on Triang's Nelly 040 tank. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if all the Matchbox engines were inspired one way or another by Triang and Hornby's offerings from around this time. The diesel shunter looks a bit like the Dock Authority shunter. The passenger coach looks more than a little like these coaches from an old Clockwork set, and the pannier tank is self-explanatory. The Matchbox trains were discontinued well before my time, but they were successful enough that it was easy to amass a collection of engines and rolling stock via the second-hand market. It was always a treat to find a Matchbox train at a car boot sale or charity shop. As much as I liked Thomas and Friends, it was nice to have a range of die-cast toy trains that weren't tied to an existing property. It would have been nice to see Matchbox continue to release new engine designs, with or without the Thomas licence. A tender engine and maybe a larger diesel or electric engine would make great additions to this range. I still think a collectible die-cast range of non-Thomas trains is something sorely needed in the modern day. A middle ground between wooden trains and electric model trains is something that I think would really appeal to slightly older children and maybe some adults as well. Originally I wasn't going to add the running number on the side, but ultimately I decided that I should probably do it in order to get myself reaccustomed to the UV mapping and texturing process. With the Matchbox engine done, it was time to move on to the Thomas characters. If you followed me on Twitter around 2019 to 2021, you may remember that this is not the first time I've modelled a hypothetical Matchbox Thomas range. I wanted to give this concept another try, partially because I thought it would make for an interesting video, and partially because I figured that there was room for improvement. With my first attempt, I gave every engine a bespoke chassis, and mainly used production material from the show as a reference, with little regard for making them stylistically resemble Matchbox trains outside of the wheels, couplings and funnels. This time I wanted to be a bit more realistic with my hypothetical toy line, while still making the toys something that I, and hopefully you viewers, would have liked to own had they existed. Of course, the main goal of any toy company is to make money, and they will often reuse components where and when they can to save a few pennies. It may be tempting to say that a Matchbox Thomas would have just been their regular 040 repainted, but I don't think that would have been the case. Britt Allcroft was famously rather strict when it came to Thomas merchandise. If a toy didn't look sufficiently like the character it was supposed to represent, it would get rejected. I think we can all agree that this was for the best. We narrowly avoided a few clangers in the early days of the Thomas merchandising empire. The Hornby Percy prototype will forever haunt me in my dreams. However, one thing that I think a Matchbox Thomas range could have reused from the regular range, at least for some of its engines, would be the chassis. So I quickly modelled the chassis for the pannier tank engine with the intention of reusing it for Thomas. After I'd done this, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to see what it would look like if I married the body of the Matchbox 040 with the 060 chassis, painting it up to look like Thomas. What I got was this. Now I don't know about you, but I actually kinda like how this looks. Obviously a Matchbox Thomas wouldn't have looked like that if Britt had anything to say about it, but I figured that some of the parts could be resized and modified rather than remade from scratch. The first thing I did was make a new running board with Thomas's iconic dipped front. I think that alone already makes it look much more like Thomas. After that, I removed the tanks and cab and set to work making new ones that look more like Thomas's own. The first attempt didn't go too well, particularly when I tried to add Thomas's side tank extensions. Like, come on bruv, what the hell is that? So then I decided to model the tanks and cabs separately, and this worked out much better. I decided to shrink the boiler to make Thomas a bit less podgy. Realistically, there's no reason why he needs to have a large boiler. It's not as if he's housing a motor or anything. I then gave Thomas the frame edges on the front of his running board, painting them red so that they looked like they were part of the running board's mould. I then gave Thomas his front cab windows. In order to stylistically match the 040, I decided to give them that same arch shape. I'm guessing that this was done on the original toy to save on costs or aid durability compared to the standard round windows. Hornby used the same cab windows for a few of their engines, including Nelly. Next was the splasher. I wanted to have all the details on Thomas's front line up with how they do in the TV series model, whilst also placing Thomas's splasher directly above his wheel, remembering to bear in mind that I couldn't reposition the wheels. I think I managed in the end. To keep the model looking toy-like, I decided to make it look like the tanks and splasher were a single mould, with a bit of relief detail to imply a gap between the two. One thing I did that is unlike a lot of Thomas toys is the addition of a tail lamp. I feel like one way to set this Matchbox Thomas range apart from a lot of Thomas merchandise lines is by focusing on relief detail, much like Matchbox's pre-existing trains. These were often not painted, so whilst I'm giving Thomas a tail lamp, it will be the same blue livery as his main body to imply that it's the same piece of metal as the tanks and cab. Likewise, I'm also giving Thomas a moulded whistle, which is, again, unpainted. With the main body done, it was now time to texture him. It was relatively straightforward to sort out the UV maps, and I then made some textures for Thomas's tanks, splasher and bunker. My idea is that the Matchbox Thomas range began in the mid-1980s, around the time of Season 1, and so Thomas has the lining on the rear of his coal bunker. He lost this on his TV series model in the early 1990s, and most of the toys followed suit soon afterwards. He got the rear lining back in the later CGI seasons, but his toys never got the same luxury. Even the new Thomas toys from 2025 didn't have the butt lining. With Thomas done, it's time to move on to the next engine. Incidentally, stay tuned until the end to see some proper renders of the Matchbox Thomas toys. I want to save the best bit till last. Well, who else were you expecting? With Thomas using the 060 chassis from the pannier tank, it only made sense for Percy to use the 040 chassis from, well, the 040 tank. I started out by getting rid of the tanks, cab and smaller details from the 040 that Percy doesn't need. After resizing Percy's smoke box and turning the boiler into a saddle tank, I decided to make the boxes on Percy's running board. I think the front ones are sandboxes and the ones near the cab are toolboxes. Incidentally, Percy's design is not symmetrical. The toolboxes on either side of his running board are different heights. I'm sure a lot of you probably already knew that, but I thought it was an interesting little fact. I modified the dome from the Matchbox 040 to look more like Percy's dome, including its brass texture. Based on Matchbox's pre-existing lineup of trains, it seems like they prefer to leave components painted or cast in one solid colour, with any 2D details being either a sticker or printed on. However, I've made an exception with Percy's dome because I imagine that Brit wouldn't have approved of it being left unpainted. Speaking of being left unpainted, I've decided not to give the engines coloured boiler bands, instead keeping them as unpainted relief detail. A number of earlier Thomas toy lines didn't colour the engine stripes, Ertl and Tomy took the relief detail route, and Wooden Railway didn't even imply the existence of the stripes during its early years, same with the Brio Thomas range. After giving Percy his water filler cap, whistle and safety valve, it was time to give him a cab. Much like Thomas, I decided to make Percy's roof a separate plastic piece. Same goes for the coal bunker. Following this, I decided to import Thomas into the scene to get an idea of scaling. I wanted these Matchbox toys to be different to Ertl in so much as they have a more consistent scaling, as well as a better coupling system. After seeing the two engines together, I felt that Percy looked a little too big, so I scaled down some of his parts. I also gave Percy Thomas's tail lamp. Following that, there wasn't much more to do. I gave Percy some detail to represent his axle housing, or whatever that thing is below his saddle tank, and texturing Percy was much simpler than Thomas. The only bit of 2D detail is the number 6 on the side of his cab. Much like Ertl in its early years, I've gone with a sticker face design for the engines. It seems more believable than 3D faces at this stage, plus I think I'll need a bit of practice before I dive headfirst into 3D face modelling. Now for the third and final engine in this video. With James we get to see two things that Matchbox never included in their range of trains. First is a tender engine, and second is an engine with more than 6 wheels. I'm basing James's chassis off of Thomas's, which in itself was based on the pannier tank. James's front wheels are 10mm diameter in contrast to his driving wheels, which are the standard 13mm. The 10mm wheels are in fact the ones that Matchbox used for the coaches and trucks in their range of trains. Now I, and I imagine a lot of people who played with Matchbox trains in their younger years, were content with pushing them along on the floor or a table. But there was a track system for the range. It was flawed, mainly due to the fact that the track could only be connected one way, which made the curved track in particular less versatile than it should be. But it did exist. I say this because I'm not sure if the Matchbox track would accommodate an engine with a rigid 8-wheel wheel arrangement, but at the same time I highly doubt that the budget for the Matchbox range would have allowed for an engine with a pivoting bogie. My solution is to make the part of the chassis housing the front axle narrower, allowing the axle to move from side to side. Following that, it was time to make James's firebox. Then it came to making James's cab, complete with rear splasher. Perhaps it was because, by this point, most of the groundwork had already been laid out, but James was quite quick to complete. With James's model mainly done, it was time to move on to his tender. This was pretty straightforward, just a square with the edges curving inwards. One flaw of the Ertl Thomas range, in my opinion, was the fact that not only did all the engines have rigid wheelbases, but rigid tenders as well, so it was difficult to have a track system that could accommodate larger engines. This is probably the reason why Ertl's track system was more like a road system, and was wide enough to fit 2 engines side by side. I think articulated or separate tenders are the way to go when it comes to toy trains. Later it was time to texture James's cab and tender. Finally, it was time to add a bit more relief detail in the form of James's safety valve and his whistle. Again, these are not separately fitted and are instead moulded into the firebox and cab roof respectively. And that's James finished and looking splendid as ever. Now for the next step. Matchbox trains have come in multiple types of packaging. The earliest releases from the 1970s came in cardboard boxes that literally looked like matchboxes, presumably explaining their name. They were also released in standard blister packs, but I've decided to go for the packaging style as seen in these images. This is my favourite packaging type because it's still a box rather than a blister pack, but you can still see the toy inside. My first attempt was pretty shoddy. I used planes to construct the packaging, not realising that planes are one-sided, and so I couldn't use a different texture or UV map on one side versus the other. So I restarted from scratch using a cube as the basis, and this was much better. The time then came to texturing the packaging. I wanted to go all out with the 1980s look, so I took inspiration not only from Matchbox's own toys, but also the various Thomas & Friends merchandise that was released during this era, most notably Ertl and Merit. I had to feature the original Thomas & Friends logo with the Railway Series style illustration. I knew that Matchbox's logo used to be red and yellow before switching to the red, yellow, white and black colour scheme that the logo still uses today. I'm not sure when exactly that happened, but it seems to have been sometime after 1985, so I've gone with the earlier colour scheme for this logo. I also had to include copyright information on the back of the box, not just for Matchbox but also for Britt Allcroft, and Kay and Ward, who continued to get name checked on most Thomas related products until around 1988 or so. Finally, I added a clear plastic sheet around the windows of the packaging. This looks opaque in the material preview, but when we see the full renders, it will be transparent. And with that said and done, it's time to look at the full renders in question. Enjoy! And there we are, Thomas, Percy and James reimagined as Matchbox toys. It's been interesting to stray out of my comfort zone after months of non-stop drawing. Don't worry, the drawing videos will continue to be made. Ultimately, it's a question of what you viewers want to see. Maybe you'd like me to alternate between a drawing video and a what if merchandise video each week. There are certainly other toy brands that I could try this out with. Maybe you'd like to see more Thomas characters reimagined in the Matchbox style. Please share your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already.